Sky News revealed the migration policy that was developed under Susan Lee but was not released, and that would limit visas from more than a dozen countries where terrorist groups are in control, including Afghanistan, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Palestine, Philippines, Somalia, just to name a few. Adam, what are your thoughts around this policy? Not that it was revealed.
Look, I think it's it's a step in the right direction. Actually, somewhat laughably, the first thing I thought was Donald Trump's famous Muslim ban immigration policy of many years ago. You might remember that. That was very controversial. But this kind of has similarities a little bit. It's not called that, but I think most of those countries that you just rattled off are certainly Muslim countries. It's not the entirety of the population from those countries, as I understand it, just certain regions. I think it's reasonable, especially in the wake of the tragedy of Bondi. I think people want to see greater quality of migration coming to Australia. They don't want to see people here where statistically there's a higher probability that they're not going to enmesh and gel with the Australian community. But the problem with the policy I see is that it's not really about numbers. I mean, I imagine that the sheer numbers of people coming from those places are pretty low, and I think the overarching anger about migration is the level. I think just the sheer quantity. I know it's been falling. Labor keeps saying it's falling from 500,000 to 300,000, which is the latest figure. But 300,000 is still a lot. And even the budget forecasts of 220, 230,000, these are still huge figures compared to any other Western country. Probably, I would say, more proportionately than any other developed country in the world. So they're still very high. Let's say it goes back to 250. That's still double what it was in the early 90s. It's roughly triple what it was in the 80s under Hawke and Keating. So these are very high levels. Do the Australian community want those levels? It looks like at the moment they don't.
You're absolutely right. And just looking at those levels, of course, this plays into our housing crisis, the cost of living, the number of hospital beds being filled up. You've written about the economic impact and how it's becoming severe now with supercharging rents. Also how 10% of Australia's population is in an economically highly disadvantaged position after this influx of 1.2 million immigrants since 2022. Can you just explain that for us?
Yeah, sure. Look, that was my column last Friday, and I started it by referring back to Queensland, where in the late 19th century we imported, as largely more or less slave labour, or at least indentured servants, we imported islanders who worked on the farms, the sugar plantations, and at one point they were about 10% of the state's population. Now in 1901 we sent them all home, largely all of them, and then I realised now, fast forward 120 years, we've still got 10% of the Australian population this time, the whole country, more than 2 million people who are in similar, obviously not as bad, but similar situation. They don't have the same rights as Australian workers. They can be certainly taken advantage of by employers who know that they can dob them into authorities if they're working too many hours, or if they can force them to accept cash work. And I'm sure that goes on a great deal. And I pointed out that this 10%. Just like back in Queensland all those years ago, this actually benefits the wealthy. The wealthy Queensland farmers did not want this labour to be sent home. And just like now, I think the inner city wealthy voters want their cheap Uber rides, they want their cheap restaurants, they want their cheap cleaners and nannies and so forth. The same sort of economic arguments are at play again. And for lower income native-born Australians, the competition for low-skilled jobs is huge. Of course, it's supercharging rents, cost of housing is through the roof. So I think the housing issue and the immigration issue really can't be separated. And so far I'd have to say, I think Angus is a bit weak, I'd probably say on that. He's just talking about supply. Everyone likes talking about supply. It's the hand-wavy, easy answer. But Labor's already trying to get supply up and it can't. The reality is you just can't build houses very quickly. It's just hard to do. You need the workers. They've got to be they have to be zoned correctly. So I think just talking about supply is not going to do it. I think you need to cut the level of immigrants.